Andalusia was a part of the Islamic world for nearly 800 years. Gardens here are a reminder of this period through until today. How did this epoch shape garden art in southern Spain, and what roles did handicrafts and architecture have in all of this? We set out on a voyage of discovery to the roots of European garden art, which are over 1,000 years old and Islamic. We start our garden pilgrimage at the Alhambra in Granada, which was under Islamic rule until the 15th century. This giant castle complex is not only a textbook example of Moorish architecture, but also of garden diversity. Of course, it is no longer quite what it was, but it still conveys an impression of an approach to life. It is also a pleasant place to spend some time among the plants and broad water surfaces, even in the hottest weather. The Alhambra is a demanding task for the gardener Cristobal Romero, for example, a man with a very emotional relationship to his workplace.
Mi conexión con la Alhambra.
My relationship with the Alhambra dates from my childhood. I lived in the Alhambra, in the Bermeja Tower, for 3 years. My father worked here too for 35 years, and I have now worked here for 33. It is my life.
Y yo llevo 33, así que mi conexión es mi vida.
Water brings life to the Alhambra Gardens. The famous water staircase still leads down through the grounds today. Starting from the highest point, the Arabs succeeded in bringing the water here a distance of 8 kilometers upriver. It also irrigates gardens that are at first hidden from visitors. The Arayanes courtyard, a representational site where the emir received his visitors. Most of them came from desert regions and were impressed by the enormous water surface that was unique in the Middle Ages. We would like to find out more about this garden from the botanist Jose Tito Rojo.
The Ariane courtyard is probably the oldest garden in the world that has still kept its original form. It has a surprisingly modern and minimalistic effect. A rectangle of white marble, one of myrtle, and another of water. It is minimalistic, yet nonetheless a medieval garden. The Arabs brought many plants with them to Al-Andalus, the useful and the purely beautiful. They ranged from the aubergine to the Damascus rose, but the most characteristic is myrtle.
Sin duda la más utilizada en los jardines, hasta el punto de que muchas veces.
The plant was even used as a metaphor for gardens. There are poems in which a king is criticized for dedicating himself to collecting myrtle plants instead of fighting wars, as a king usually does.
En vez de hacer la guerra, que es lo que un rey, como Dios manda, debía hacer.
The basin is fed on the 2 front sides by bubbling fountains. Their flow cleverly slowed down so that the quiet mirror surface of the water is not disturbed by the movement. When the sun is directly over the courtyard at midday and a light breeze is also rippling the water, the delicate stucco work comes to life. Stalactite vaults of this kind could be found in Persian gardens at an earlier period. Garden lovers were open to influences from around the world, even in that early time. Curled palm leaves and pines are typical decorative motifs at the Alhambra. Calligraphy praising God and the Emir embellish the surrounding walls. The azulejos are masterworks of Arab Andalusian art. In a studio set among the mountains behind Granada, we enter into the mild and medieval colour world of the azulejos, as created by Fatima Quesada and her daughter Luz. Luz helps her mother with the complex work these very small tiles demand. They are so small that they must first be prepared in the studio before going to the craftspeople who do the tile-laying work. Fatima Quesada not only produces tiles, she also creates the different shapes and colours for them, precisely as they used to be in the Middle Ages. All of these tasks need preparation. Her daughter, Luz, places many parts together until the standard size of a tile is reached. She then sticks them together temporarily. The adhesive can be removed once the tile has been correctly placed. Fatima sets out the entire pattern, numbering and sticking all the units together as preparation work for the tiler. How did she find her way to the ancient craft of tile maker?
I was a ceramicist at Madrid Art School and was asked to make some azulejos by the director. At first, I felt a little insulted because I wanted to be creating works of art as a ceramicist. But today, I am proud to be a tile maker. I make my small geometrical tiles with my own colours, and I am happy because they are not only good for a tiled wall or a museum, but apart from that, they have been used for many years by virtually everyone.
No valen solamente para estar en una pared o en un museo. Sirven para toda la gente, los usa y además permanecen durante muchos años. Pero quizá los países del sur.
People love colour in the countries of the south. I often say the North Europeans are afraid of colour. But down here in the south, this fear is unknown, and we combine all colours. A German would never use all colours in his house. No, only one or two. White or grey. That represents an entirely different tradition.
Pero esto representa otra tradición.
Her efforts to revive the colour traditions of medieval Al-Andalus involved many years of research into the various minerals that had once been used. She had to decide for herself what minerals to use and then mix the different shades. Fatima Quesada shares her fascination for the Arab love of beauty with Manuel Garcia. The landscape architect has built a home in the Bay of Marbella in southern Spain. It is as magnificent as the palace of an emir. And there is a reason why this idea comes to mind.
Y yo he nacido en Al-Andalus, Marbella.
I was born in Al-Andalus, in an old Hispanic Arab courtyard house in the centre of Marbella. Courtyard houses and Hispanic Arab gardens are my life.
Desde que nací.
This natural sense of being part of a long tradition still appears to flourish today, although the Arab epoch ended centuries ago. Linear watercourses and groups of fountains belong to the distinctive repertoire of Manuel Garcia in his work as a garden designer. The Arab cultural heritage is the foundation he builds on.
Yo soy el heredero del patrimonio jardinero andaluz.
Yes, I am an heir of the Andalusian garden art tradition. Maintaining this culture is my obligation because it is ever more in danger of being forgotten. The heritage needs to be protected by caring for the medieval gardens of Al-Andalus. It is important here to follow a rule. The Hispanic Arab garden always has a central axis that divides the garden into two areas. This is usually with the use of water, or in the case of this garden, where there is no water, with a central axis path, directing your gaze to focus on a single point. This is a perfect Hispanic Arab garden, but it is only one possibility out of many. There are thousands of gardens within this system, and the crucial element in them all is the creativity of the artist.
Ese es el jardín hispano-árabe perfecto. Pero eso solamente es un orden.
It is not enough simply to create the axis. Making a garden is always far more complicated.
Ya influye, no por crear un eje axial está hecho el jardín. No, es mucho más complicado que eso.
We can see how complex in his garden. The high cypresses have the effect of slender columns, untypical for an Arab garden, which ought to be laid out starting from the top, like a carpet pattern. The combination, however, of pomegranates and roses, the useful and the beautiful, is a traditional concept. We set out for the nearby city of Malaga, where Arab life in Europe had its beginnings 1,300 years ago. Malaga flourished in the Middle Ages with its trading port. The Alcazar, the citadel of Malaga, had already been built in the 11th century. It was the residence of the Arab rulers, and the ground plan later served as a pattern for the Alhambra in Granada. The Arabs brought bitter orange trees with them from North Africa and planted them even in their fortifications. This is because they created gardens wherever they settled. They needed water to do this, and they directed it down from the highest point through the entire garden. Water was a precious commodity for them. They paid homage to it in open watercourses and superb fountains. They wanted to be surrounded by the sight of clear water and to hear the refreshing sounds it makes. The Arabs built with bricks even in those early times, and this method assured rapid building progress. But in the final analysis, beauty was the one thing that mattered. Only a few last remnants of the decoration have survived, but it is not difficult to imagine what oases these inner courtyards must have been. The channels were laid in curves to slow down the flow of the water. But there was a second reason why they favoured this shape. Their so-called elbow gates were also built to a similar principle, to slow down attackers. They managed to slow them down until the end of the 15th century, when the Catholic kings finally succeeded in reconquering Malaga and permitted a few Muslim families to remain in the city. We are on our way to Cordoba. 1,000 years ago, it was the capital of Al-Andalus and also a city of fabled gardens. Has this tradition left any traces? Cordoba has remained to this day a symbol for the peaceful coexistence of three religions during the Middle Ages. Muslims, Jews and Christians lived in these alleys. The houses here give the impression of being closed to the outer world, as is common in the Arab countries. But the walls hide a specialty of Cordoba. The patios, as the inner courtyards are known, had their origins with the Romans and their atrium villas. The Arabs adopted this architectural style because it functions so well even today. Araceli Ajona waters the little plant pots for several hours every day. She loves to share with visitors here passion for the patio tradition of her city. Situated on the banks of the river Guadalquivir, Cordoba had the water it needed to become a city of gardens. There were once some 5,000 water wheels at work raising the river water. The mezquita was once the main mosque. Today, it is a cathedral. The orange tree courtyard, dating from the 8th century, is considered to be the oldest garden in the world. But the historian Pedro Marfil has a surprise.
No tenemos ninguna información acerca de vegetación en este momento, pero se hace el patio y la torre.
We have no information about the plants here in the early days, but we know that under the rule of the Umayyad dynasty, the law Maliki prohibited any vegetation in courtyards, but plants were still grown despite this law.
Since when have oranges been grown then in the mezquita courtyard?
I believe the orange trees must have been introduced with the structural changes made during the Baroque period. This was when the Santa Maria fountain was built. It is probable that the ground level was raised and that orange trees were planted with their trunks continuing the line of the building interior columns to create a Baroque theatre.
Los árboles que yo pienso que había eran olivos y palmeras.
I believe olive trees and palms grew here previously. There is a 600-year-old olive tree, and it is still flourishing. It is not in line with the other trees in the courtyard, and this means it is older than the Baroque fountain and the rest of the courtyard. Apart from that, we know from the Christian emblems of Cordoba, dating from the 13th century, that the mezquita was originally shaded by palm trees.
The most famous Islamic orange tree courtyard of the Middle Ages is thus, in reality, a Baroque creation, an interesting revelation. We encounter some remnants of the Arab city walls dating from the 10th century. These surrounded the city as a defence. For centuries, the Andalusians wanted nothing more to do with their Arab heritage. The Christian conquerors took over the buildings from their predecessors, and an Arab palace, together with its gardens, became the residence of the Catholic kings. We no longer know what these looked like at that time. What we can see today dates from the middle of the last century, and it was inspired by the Islamic garden tradition, in which water played such an important role. Nonetheless, the garden is divided into different areas, with alleyways and neatly trimmed hedges in the manner of the classic European garden. A visit is especially rewarding in autumn, when the opulent celosia and the delicate roses are bathed in a soft light. About 60 years ago, the mayor of Cordoba recognized the tourism potential of the Arab garden heritage, and he combined it with the romantic image of the Orient. This includes the cypresses, although these trees first arrived in the gardens of Andalusia in the 19th century. One thing that has been maintained through all the ages, however, is the irrigation method. In the early hours of the morning, when the heat has not had time to evaporate the water, the gardeners flood the flower beds and the soil soaks full with water. Several ages coexist in the garden, the traditional and the modern. José Álvarez was born in Cordoba, and he reflects on the finer moments in the tumultuous history of his city.
No se puede negar que el Islam se propagó por el norte de África.
There is no doubt that Islam expanded from North Africa, as was usual at the time. But the different religions nevertheless experienced moments of peaceful life in harmonious coexistence.
Las religiones pasó por grandes momentos de paz y de tranquilidad, de coexistencia pacífica. Y esto supuso un enriquecimiento.
What we are talking about here are three religions, but a single Andalusian culture. It was a culture that permitted a coexistence of the religions, each of which enriched the others.
La coexistencia entre religiones que se enriquecen entre ellas.
One example of this interreligious enrichment in Andalusian society of the late Middle Ages can be found in the Bartolomé Chapel. It was built by a group of people known as the Mudayha. These were Muslims who stayed here after the Reconquest. Their clients were Christians, and as a result, the architecture they created is Christian, but the decoration is Arab. It consists purely of ornament, because the Mudayhas lost their feel for the Arabic language as time passed. Cordoba is a fruitful ground for old handicraft traditions. José Carlos Villarejo is a craftsman in leather. He makes what are known as guadamesí. Sheepskins are stretched over a wooden frame, completely covered in gold or silver leaf, and then painted. In the last phase, the lines must be drawn for the final embossing.
I am the third generation that has worked on the revival of the original guadamesí of the Caliphate of Cordoba. The technique we discovered dates from the 10th century.
The finest items are on display in a small museum, which his uncle built. This uncle was also the man who researched the medieval technique for over 50 years. Small metal stamps are used to emboss the pattern into the fine leather. The technique is mostly used to produce picture frames today, But in the Middle Ages, giant guadamací decorated the walls in the palace city of Madinat al-Zahra.
There are legends and written chronicles that document how Madinat al-Zahra was known as the Magnificent. Whenever the sun shone over the city, the guadamací on the palace walls were a brilliant blaze of gold and silver. There are many other written records attesting how guadamací were first made in Cordoba, at Madinat al-Zahra.
Madinat al-Zahra is a palace city in a geometrical layout, with gardens dating from the 10th century. It was constructed in several terraces on the foothills of the Sierra Morena. The Caliph resided in the highest sector, the court officials in the middle, and the ordinary people were at their feet. The water for the garden complex was brought here by a 19-kilometre-long aqueduct. Exactly how these gardens looked is not known, but pollen tests have shown that fruit trees grew here, and these were only of types that had always been native to the region, such as the strawberry tree. The giant water surface reflects the power of the Caliph. The Garden of the Prince. This is a small garden, but the stony structure gives a very clear idea of what it must once have looked like. Pollen studies have shown that plum trees and basil grew here. The useful and the beautiful, always hand in hand, even in a princely garden. Only in a few points is it now possible to imagine how magnificent it must once have appeared. These gardens were greatly admired 1,000 years ago and influenced the garden art of Andalusia. For example, in Seville, bitter oranges have flourished here since the 8th century. They were introduced by the Arabs. The streets of the city are full of the ripe fruit in January every year. The absurd thing about this is no one knows what to do with them. The Spaniards are not fond of bitter oranges. Even for the Arabs, the intense perfume of the blossom was much more interesting than the fruit. The Arabs love orange flower water and use it as an aroma in their sweets. Today, the ripe oranges are taken to a factory for processing and emerge as a puree, which is used, for example, by the English to make their familiar bitter orange marmalade. The important thing here is to keep the fruit pulp separate from the peel, which is cut in either thick or thin strips, depending on the taste of the user. The two are only mixed at the end of the process and exported abroad in this form as fruit mixtures. In the Alcazar in Seville, the rulers of the Almohad dynasty greatly valued the beauty of the orange trees. King Al-Mutamid had trees with white blossoms only planted for his wife from Cordoba because she greatly missed the snow on the mountains. First, the almond and then the orange blossoms transformed the gardens into white landscapes. In the extensive palace gardens stands the Alcoba, a pavilion dating from Moorish times, which has been surrounded by orange trees from time immemorial. And this is the oldest orange tree in the world. It dates from the 14th century. At that time, there was already a Catholic king, Pedro I, who titled himself Sultan. Arab culture was so strongly anchored at the time that he had his new palace built in Arab style, and an inner courtyard garden was essential. It is a curious story. A Catholic king has his palace built by Muslim architects, lent to him by his friend Mohammed V, who in turn had to stop the work on his own construction site, the Alhambra, for 3 years. The new palace was financed by Jewish bankers. Manuel Hurtado, a historian working at the Alcazar, tells us the tumultuous history of what was known as the Courtyard of the Virgins.
Ese jardín fue tapado durante el siglo XVI.
This garden was buried during the 16th century because it was not felt to be suitable for a European way of life. A large space in which concerts and banquets could be held was now wanted instead, so the garden was buried under a layer of sand and covered with marble slabs. 7 years ago, during an architectural dig, we discovered that the original garden dating from the 14th century is still intact. We cleared away the sand and discovered the courtyard of the Virgins. We took pollen samples and discovered traces of violets and orange trees, original bitter oranges from the 14th century.
The dark points mark the openings from which the water once ran to flood the flower beds that were on a lower level. When people strolled through the garden, their noses were on the same level as the finely perfumed flowers. We are leaving the shaded royal courtyard and are travelling to Ronda. It is built on a mountain plateau and is divided in the middle by a 100-metre deep gorge. The location has been inhabited since the earliest times, and during the Middle Ages it achieved enormous significance as the crossroads of several important trade routes. Ronda today is off the beaten path. And the town lives from tourism. Over the centuries, Ronda was an attractive location for merchant families. The Palacio Mondragon houses a museum today and shows how the rich and powerful lived in previous centuries. Shaded green oases and splashing fountains had been essentials in every palace since Islamic times. The inner courtyard arcades were equally essential. They were built using kiln-fired bricks and decorated with azulejos. The geographical situation of the town sets natural limits on the amount of space available for gardens, but necessity is the mother of invention. High above the El Tajo Gorge in the garden of the Palacio Rey Moro, the king of the Moors' palace is perched. The name is a pure fiction because this garden never had a palace or a king. A duchess from Malaga established this garden in the early 20th century. She commissioned the famous French landscape architect Nicolas Forestier. He was an enthusiastic admirer of the Arab Andalusian garden art heritage. In the best Islamic tradition, a water axis cuts the garden into 2 equal halves. The high trees have grown and are no longer in keeping with the original garden design, but the view still is spectacular. Andalusian craftsmen provided the tiled benches. Their colours are set off to good effect by this very green garden. a Roman arch serves as an eye-catcher at the far end of the garden and frames the landscape views. "100 years ago, Forestier helped to re-establish awareness for Islamic gardens, the finest of which are found in Granada. Granada is a modern and young city with generously dimensioned squares and streets. The business life is focused in the area around the cathedral. Granada had Muslim rulers for almost 800 years, and they have left their mark on the city through until today. On the banks of the River Darro, we find a house dating from the 14th century. It is located directly below the Alhambra and was built at the same time. The architect and passionate collector Carlos Sanchez recognized and discovered the hidden treasures of this house.
Cuando entró aquí, en lo que yo no veía nada, me dijo,
The moment I entered, I said to myself, Carlos, this is an Arabic house, and it is complete. I made a drawing so I could be quite sure about this feeling. I told myself, buy this house. It is something altogether unique.
compra esta casa, que es una pieza única. Yo iba investigando.
I dedicated 5 years of my life to what has been an impassioned masterwork for me that has also had a strong influence on my career.
Ha marcado de alguna manera mi trayectoria profesional.
The longer he thought about the house, the more his ambition was stirred.
Soy muy investigador, me gusta mucho investigar.
I am a passionate researcher, and I love to investigate. This is why I began to collect old chronographies of Granada, because I felt I would discover something in these old records about the house.
A encontrar cosas. A ver qué pieza puede ser interesante. Esta es otro calotipo.
This is an early calotype of the Alhambra by Pablo Marés, a very early work dating from 1825.
Muy temprana.
Carlos Sanchez is now a leading collector of early photographs of Andalusia. His home is the Arab house on the Darro in Albaicin, the oldest city quarter in Granada. The Albaicin owes its appearance to the Arabs, who first settled in the narrow streets on this hill. Hermetic walls stretch along the route and still provide clear evidence of how private and public life were once separated. Hundreds of gardens are hidden behind these blank walls. The so-called Carmen Gardens are a traditional feature of Granada. Protected by a wall dating from the 12th century, the Carmen de los Cipreses is laid out on terraces. The name Carmen is derived from the Arabic word carm, which means vine. And the vine is as essential in a Carmen garden as the useful fruit trees. The kitchen garden is on the lowest of the terraces, with pomegranates, medlars, figs and quinces. All the Carmen Gardens of Granada are in the Albaicin quarter, and for this reason they all have one thing in common: a view of the Alhambra. The house dates from the 12th century and is owned by Francisco Fabregas and his wife. He bought the house that had previously been in family ownership since the 18th century. Since his retirement as a Spanish diplomat, he spends much of his time here. What does his Carmen de los Cipreses mean to him?
El sitio más maravilloso en donde se puede vivir.
The most wonderful place where you can live, dream and live.
No es un jardín.
It is a way of life. It is far more than a garden. It is a place of entertainment, but above all of dreams.
Es un lugar de esparcimiento y sobre todo es un sitio para soñar. En el principio de los años...
During the 1920s, Federico García Lorca and Manuel de Falla met in this garden. Under this pergola, they read books and poems.
Y leían libros y poesías.
Who would be surprised to hear how writers and composers were inspired by the beauty of this place? The inner courtyard of the atrium house contains a beautiful floor mosaic made entirely from round pebbles. It is centuries old and is made to a pattern originally found in Arab palaces. Only very few masters of this art are at work today. We set off to meet Jacinto Perez, who restored the mosaic. We would like to watch him at work. Before Jacinto Perez traces the outline of his flowers and ornaments in the cement sand, he first discusses the design with the clients. Do they want abstract and geometric patterns, or would they rather have something more playful? His services are in demand for modern houses as well as in traditional ones. He offers designs once used in antiquity and modern ones too. He also restores mosaics. He has acquired a large repertoire of designs in decades of work. He is not only one of the few people to have mastered this traditional craft, but he also has a reputation for excellence. The black pebbles are from Granada, the pale ones from Almeria. Routine has made him a fast worker. He has only been at work on this site for 2 days. Jacinto Perez enthuses about commissions in Nazareth in Israel, but also at a place we have already encountered.
Otro de los sitios más es Carmen de los Cipreses, que ahí me inauguré yo.
Carmen de los Cipreses is one of those other places. It was here that I fell in love with this craft. This was the work my father did, and it was handed down from our forefathers. I ignored my studies a little and dedicated myself to this profession instead. I have good memories of this commission.
A la que hoy en día es mi profesión, y tengo buenos recuerdos de ese trabajo.
Some decades have passed since then, and much has changed. In the past, his father managed a large company with numerous employees. But today, only very few people are interested in taking up this profession. A small partnership in which he and his brother do everything is all that is left of the company. What is his view of the profession? Would he rather change to do something else?
No concibo otra profesión.
I would not be able to find other work, but this is a job that fills me with passion. Each work has its own history, and every commission is a new challenge. And the fact is, I am grateful.
Good craftspeople never simply appear out of thin air. They need examples, and these can be found at the Alhambra. For centuries, the best have always worked here, not least in the gardens. It is frequently only romantic impressions that give a hint of the former magnificence here. Kitchen gardens still are largely found along the route from the Alhambra to the Generalife Summer Palace. The situation is somewhat higher, and a reliably constant cool wind assured pleasant climatic conditions in the private retreat of the Emir and his family. And once again, how could it be otherwise? Water takes centre stage. There is no doubt about it. The two fountains on both sides of the courtyard have been bubbling since the Middle Ages. But historians dispute the origin of the fountains in the pools. Some of them suspect these first arrived in the 19th century. The delicate architecture and the garden itself together form a single unit. The combined effect was of a luxurious and at the same time intimate living space in the middle of heat and dust. Even though the Alhambra is a gigantic and well-organized tourism business, the gardens retain the feel of a quiet park. We should never forget that we are in one of the most famous historic gardens in Europe. Keeping such a heritage alive demands intelligent planning, hard work, and above all, loving commitment. The gardener Cristobal Romero provides these virtues.
Cada año, cuando empiezas tu labor, desde que empiezas a seleccionar las semillas.
Each year when you start working, you are already being creative. First, in selecting the seeds for the coming season. We change plants twice a year, once from winter to spring and once from summer to autumn. Twice a year, everything changes completely.
Dos veces todo cambia y empieza, ves nacer las plantas, desarrollarse, morir.
You watch the plants sprout, see how they grow and finally die. You connect all of this with your own life, and the process is fascinating. One of the most interesting moments in the garden is not when all the plants are magnificently in bloom, but when they lose what you might call their official beauty, which everyone loves and recognizes. This is followed by another phase of beauty. We are not trained to recognize or see it. And this is a fascinating thing that opens to you in the course of the work. The place has a powerful atmosphere. This is one of the reasons why I have worked here for so long, and I think perhaps it may even be possible to become a part of this aura. Is it possible to understand the spirit of place and to communicate with it? It is not material. It is something you discover with your emotions. And this is where you feel it, where you encounter the spirit of the place.
Can a garden gather this special spirit to itself through the centuries? Or is it the reason why this location was chosen for the garden in the first place? Whatever the case, the atmosphere of the Alhambra Gardens still moves people today and is an indication of how they experience a relationship to the Islamic culture that is still alive in Andalusia. It is a shared heritage. Its forms and colours slumber as a memory in all of us. And when we see it, we recognize it as a part of ourselves.